Hello, and welcome back to the Reading Corner. I'm your host, Renee, and I am here for you every Wednesday reading stories in the public domain. We are currently reading through Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskell, written in 1853. And without further ado, let's get into it. Chapter 6. Poor Peter. Poor Peter's career lay before him rather pleasantly mapped out by kind friends, but bonus Bernandus non videt omnia in this map too. He was to win honours at the Shrewsbury School and carry them thick to Cambridge, and after that a living awaited him, the gift of his godfather, Sir Peter Airlie. Poor Peter! His lot in life was very different to what his friends had hoped and planned. Miss Matty told me all about it, and I think it was a relief when she had done so. He was the darling of his mother, who seemed to dote on all her children, though she was, perhaps, a little afraid of Deborah's superior acquirements. Deborah was the favourite of her father, and when Peter disappointed him, she became his pride. The sole honour Peter brought away from Shrewsbury was the reputation of being the best good fellow that ever was, and of being the captain of the school in the art of practical joking. His father was disappointed, but set about remedying the matter in a manly way. He could not afford to send Peter to read with any tutor, but he could read with him himself, and Miss Matty told me much of the awful preparations in the way of dictionaries and lexicons that were made in her father's study the morning Peter began. "My poor mother," said she, "I remember how she used to stand in the hall, just near enough the study door to catch the tone of my father's voice. I could tell in a moment if all was going right by her face, and it did go right for a long time." "What went wrong at last?" said I. "That tiresome Latin, I dare say." "No, it was not the Latin. Peter was in high favour with my father, for he worked up well for him, but he seemed to think that the Cranford people might be joked about and made fun of, and they did not like it. Nobody does. He was always hoaxing them. Hoaxing is not a pretty word, my dear, and I hope you won't tell your father I used it, for I should not like him to think that I was not choice in my language, after living with such a woman as Deborah. And be sure you never use it yourself. I don't know how it slipped out of my mouth, except it was that I was thinking of poor Peter, and it was always his expression. But he was a very gentlemanly boy in many things. He was like dear Captain Brown in always being ready to help any old person or a child. Still, he did like joking and making fun, and he seemed to think the old ladies in Cranford would believe anything. There were so many old ladies living here then. We are principally ladies now, I know, but we are not so old as the ladies used to be when I was a girl. I could laugh to think of some of Peter's jokes. No, my dear, I won't tell you of them, because they might not shock you as they ought to do, and they were very shocking. He even took in my father once, by dressing himself up as a lady that was passing through the town, and wished to see the rector of Cranford, who had published the admirable Aziz sermon. Peter said he was awfully frightened himself when he saw how my father took it all in, and even offered to copy out all his Napoleon Bonaparte sermon for her. Her, for Peter was a lady then. He told me he was more terrified than he ever was before, all the time my father was speaking. He did not think my father would have believed him, and yet if he had not, it would have been a sad thing for Peter. As it was, he was none so glad of it, for my father kept him hard at work copying out all those 12 Bonaparte sermons for the lady. That was for Peter himself, you know. He was the lady. And once, when he wanted to go fishing, Peter said, "Oh, confound the woman!" Very bad language, my dear, but Peter was not always so guarded as he should have been. My father was so angry with him, it nearly frightened me out of my wits, and yet I could hardly keep from laughing at the little curtsies Peter kept making, quite slyly, whenever my father spoke of the lady's excellent taste and sound discrimination. "Did Miss Jenkins know of these tricks?" said I. "Oh, no, Deborah would have been much too shocked. No one knew but me. I wish I had always known of Peter's plans, but sometimes he did not tell me. He used to say the old ladies in the town wanted something to talk about, but I don't think they did. They had the St. James Chronicle 3 times a week, just as we have now, and we have plenty to say, and I remember the clacking noise there always was when some of the ladies got together. But probably schoolboys talk more than ladies. At last there was a terrible sad thing that happened. Miss Matty got up, went to the door, and opened it. No one was there. She rang the bell for Martha, and when Martha came, her mistress told her to go for eggs to a farm at the other end of town. "I will lock the door after you, Martha. You are not afraid to go, are you?" "No, ma'am, not at all. Jem Heron will be only too proud to go with me." Miss Matty drew herself up, and as soon as we were alone, she wished that Martha had more maidenly reserve. "We'll put out the candle, my dear. We can talk just as well by firelight, you know. There. Well, you see, Deborah had gone from home for a fortnight or so. It was a very still, quiet day, I remember, overhead, and the lilacs were all in flower, so I suppose it was spring. My father had gone out to see some sick people in the parish. I recollect seeing him leave the house with his wig and shovel hat and cane. What possessed our poor Peter, I don't know. He had the sweetest temper, and yet he always seemed to like to plague Deborah. She never laughed at his jokes, and thought him ungenteel, and not careful enough about improving his mind, and that vexed him. Well, he went to her room, it seems, and dressed himself in her old gown and shawl and bonnet, just the things she used to wear in Cranford, and was known by everywhere, and he made the pillow into a little— Are you sure you locked the door, my dear? For I should not like anyone to hear— into a little baby with white long clothes. It was only, as he told me afterwards, to make something to talk about in the town. He never thought of it affecting Deborah, and he went and walked up and down in the Filbert walk, just half hidden by the rails, and half seen, and he cuddled his pillow, just like a baby, and talked to it all the nonsense people do. Oh dear, and my father came stepping stately up the street, as he always did, and what should he see but a little black crowd of people, I dare say as many as 20, all peeping through his garden rails. So he thought at first they were only looking at a new rhododendron that was in full bloom, and that he was very proud of, and he walked slower, that they might have some more time to admire, and he wondered if he could make out a sermon from the occasion, and thought perhaps there was some relation between the rhododendrons and the lilies of the field. My poor father, when he came nearer, he began to wonder that they did not see him, but the heads were all so close together, peeping and peeping. My father was amongst them, meaning, he said, to ask them to walk into the garden with him and admire the beautiful vegetable production. When, oh my dear, I tremble to think of it, he looked through the rails himself and saw— I don't know what he thought he saw, but old Clare told me his face went quite grey-white with anger, and his eyes blazed out under his frowning black brows, and he spoke out, oh so terribly, and bade them all stop where they were, not one of them to go, not one of them to stir a step. And swift as light, he was in at the garden door, and down the Filbert walk, and seized hold of poor Peter, and tore his clothes off his back, bonnet, shawl, gown and all, and threw the pillow among the people over the railings. And then he was very, very angry indeed, and before all the people he lifted up his cane and flogged Peter. My dear, that boy's trick on that sunny day, when all seemed going straight and well, broke my mother's heart, and changed my father for life. It did indeed. Old Clare said Peter looked as white as my father, and stood as still as a statue to be flogged, and my father struck hard. When my father stopped to take a breath, Peter said, "Have you done enough, sir?" quite hoarsely, and still standing quite quiet. I don't know what my father said, or if he said anything, but old Clare said, Peter turned to where the people outside the railing were, and made them a low bow, as grand and as grave as any gentleman, and then walked slowly into the house. I was in the storeroom, helping my mother to make cowslip wine. I cannot abide the wine now, nor the scent of the flowers. They turn me sick and faint, as they did that day when Peter came in, looking as haughty as any man, indeed looking like a man, not like a boy. "Mother," he said, "I am come to say, God bless you for ever." I saw his lips quiver as he spoke, and I think he durst not say anything more loving, for the purpose that was in his heart. She looked at him rather frightened and wondering, and asked him what was to do. He did not smile or speak, but put his arms round her and kissed her as if he did not know how to leave off, and before she could speak again, he was gone. We talked it over, and could not understand it, and she bade me go and seek my father, and ask what it was all about. I found him walking up and down, looking very highly displeased. "Tell your mother I have flogged Peter, and that he richly deserved it." I durst not ask any more questions. When I told my mother, she sat down quite faint for a minute. I remember a few days after, I saw the poor withered cowslip flowers thrown out to the leaf heap, to decay and die there. There was no making of cowslip wine that year at the rectory, nor indeed ever after. Presently my mother went to my father. I know I thought of Queen Esther and King Ahasuerus, for my mother was very pretty and delicate-looking, and my father looked as terrible as King Ahasuerus. Some time after, they came out together, and then my mother told me what had happened, and that she was going up to Peter's room at my father's desire, though she was not to tell Peter this, to talk the matter over with him. But no Peter was there. We looked over the house, no Peter was there. Even my father, who had not liked to join in the search at first, helped us before long. The rectory was a very old house, steps up into a room, steps down into a room, all through. At first my mother was calling low and soft, as if to reassure the poor boy. "Peter, Peter dear, it's only me." But by and by, as the servants came back from the errands my father had sent them in different directions to find where Peter was, as we found he was not in the garden, nor the hayloft, nor anywhere about, my mother's cry grew louder and wilder. "Peter, my darling, Peter, where are you?" For then she felt and understood that that long kiss meant some sad kind of goodbye. The afternoon went on, my mother never resting, but seeking again and again in every possible place that had been looked into 20 times before, nay, that she had looked into over and over again herself. My father sat with his head in his hands, not speaking except when his messengers came in, bringing no tidings. Then he lifted up his face, so strong and sad, and told them to go again in some new direction. My mother kept passing from room to room, in and out of the house, moving noiselessly, but never ceasing. Neither she nor my father durst leave the house, which was the meeting-place for all the messengers. At last it was nearly dark, and my father rose up. He took hold of my mother's arm as she came with wild, sad pace through one door, and quickly toward another. She started at the touch of his hand, for she had forgotten all in the world but Peter. "Molly," said he, "I did not think all this would happen." He looked into her face for comfort, her poor face all wild and white, for neither she nor my father had dared to acknowledge, much less act upon the terror that was in their hearts, lest Peter should have made away with himself. My father saw no conscious look in his wife's hot, dreary eyes, and he missed the sympathy that she had always been ready to give him, strong man as he was, and at the dumb despair in her face his tears began to flow. But when she saw this, a gentle sorrow came over her countenance, and she said, "Dearest John, don't cry. Come with me and we'll find him," almost as cheerfully as if she knew where he was. And she took my father's great hand in her little soft one, and led him along, the tears dropping as he walked on that same unceasing weary walk from room to room, through house and garden. Oh, how I wished for Deborah! I had no time for crying, for now all seemed to depend on me. I wrote for Deborah to come home. I sent a message privately to that same Mr. Holbrook's house. Poor Mr. Holbrook, you know who I mean. I don't mean I sent a message to him, but I sent one that I could trust to know if Peter was at his house. For at one time Mr. Holbrook was an occasional visitor at the rectory. You know, he was Miss Pole's cousin, and he had been very kind to Peter, and taught him how to fish. He was very kind to everybody, and I thought Peter might have gone off there. But Mr. Holbrook was from home, and Peter had never been seen. It was night now, but the doors were all wide open, and my father and mother walked on and on. It was more than an hour since he had joined her, and I don't believe they had ever spoken all the time. I was getting the parlour fire lighted, and one of the servants was preparing tea, for I wanted them to have something to eat and drink and warm them, when old Clare asked to speak to me. "I have borrowed the nets from the Weir, Miss Matty. Shall we drag the ponds tonight, or wait for the morning?" I remember staring into his face to gather his meaning, and when I did, I laughed out loud. The horror of that new thought, our bright, darling Peter, cold, stark, and dead. I remember the ring of my own laugh now. The next day, Deborah was at home before I was myself again. She would not have been so weak as to give way as I had done, but my screams, my horrible laughter had ended in crying, had roused my sweet dear mother, whose poor wandering wits were called back and collected as soon as a child needed her care. She and Deborah sat by my bedside. I knew by the looks of each that there had been no news of Peter, no awful, ghastly news, which was what I had most dreaded in my dull state between sleeping and waking. The same result of all the searching had brought something of the same relief to my mother, to whom I am sure the thought that Peter might even then be hanging dead in some of the familiar home places had caused that never-ending walk of yesterday. Her soft eyes never were the same again after that. They had always a restless, craving look, as if seeking for what they could not find. Oh, it was an awful time, coming down like a thunderbolt on the still sunny day when the lilacs were all in bloom. "Where was Mr. Peter?" said I. "He had made his way to Liverpool, and there was war then, and some of the king's ships lay off the mouth of the Mersey, and they were only too glad to have a fine likely boy such as him, 5'9" he was, come to offer himself. The captain wrote to my father, and Peter wrote to my mother. Stay, those letters will be somewhere here." We lighted the candle, and found the captain's letter, and Peter's too, and we also found a little simple begging letter from Mrs. Jenkins to Peter, addressed to him at the house of an old schoolfellow, whither she fancied he might have gone. They had returned it unopened, and unopened it had remained ever since, having been inadvertently put by amongst the other letters of that time. This is it. "My dearest Peter, you did not think we should be so sorry as we are, I know, or you would never have gone away. You are too good. Your father sits and sighs till my heart aches to hear him. He cannot hold up his head for grief, and yet he only did what he thought was right. Perhaps he has been too severe, and perhaps I have not been kind enough, but God knows how we love you, my dear only boy. Don looks so sorry you are gone. Come back and make us happy, who love you so much. I know you will come back." But Peter did not come back. That spring day was the last time he ever saw his mother's face. The writer of the letter, the last, the only person who had ever seen what was written in it, was dead long ago, and I, a stranger, not born at the time when this occurrence took place, was the only one to open it. The captain's letter summoned the father and mother to Liverpool instantly, if they wished to see their boy, and by some of the wild chances of life, the captain's letter had been detained somewhere, somehow. Miss Matty went on. "And it was race time, and all the post-horses at Cranford were gone to the races. But my father and mother sent off in our own gig, and oh, my dear, they were too late. The ship was gone. And now read Peter's letter to my mother." It was full of love and sorrow, and pride in his new profession, and a sore sense of his disgrace in the eyes of the people at Cranford, but ending with a passionate entreaty that she would come and see him before he left the Mercy. "Mother, we may go into battle. I hope we shall, and lick those French, but I must see you again before that time." "And she was too late," said Miss Matty. "Too late." We sat in silence, pondering on the full meaning of those sad, sad words. At length, I asked Miss Matty to tell me how her mother bore it. "Oh," she said, "she was patience itself. She had never been strong, and this weakened her terribly. My father used to sit looking at her, far more sad than she was. He seemed as if he could look at nothing else when she was by, and he was so humble, so very gentle now. He would perhaps speak in his old way, laying down the law as it were, but then, in a minute or two, he would come round and put his hand on our shoulders and ask us in a low voice if he had said anything to hurt us. I did not wonder at his speaking so to Deborah, for she was so clever, but I could not bear to hear him talking so to me. But, you see, he saw what we did not, that it was killing my mother. Yes, killing her. Put out the candle, my dear. I can talk better in the dark." For she was but a frail woman, and ill-fitted to stand the fright and shock she had gone through, and she would smile at him and comfort him, not in words, but in her looks and tones, which were always cheerful when he was there. And she would speak of how she thought Peter stood a good chance of being admiral very soon. He was so brave and clever, and how she thought of seeing him in his navy uniform, and what sort of hats admirals wore, and how much more fit he was to be a sailor than a clergyman, and all in that way, just to make my father think she was quite glad of what came of that unlucky morning's work, and the flogging, which was always in his mind, as we all knew. But oh, my dear, the bitter crying she had when she was alone, and at last, as she grew weaker, she could not keep her tears in when Deborah or me was by, and would give us message after message for Peter. His ship had gone to the Mediterranean, or somewhere down there, and then he was ordered off to India, and there was no overland route then. But she still said that no one knew where their death lay in wait, and that we were not to think hers was near. We did not think it, but we knew it, as we saw her fading away. Well, my dear, it was very foolish of me, I know, when in all likelihood I am so near seeing her again. And only think, love, the very day after her death, for she did not live quite a 12-month after Peter went away, the very day after came a parcel for her from India, from her poor boy. It was a large, soft, white Indian shawl, with just a little narrow border all round, just what my mother would have liked. We thought it might rouse my father, for he had sat with her hand in his all night long. So Deborah took it in to him, and Peter's letter to her, and all. At first he took no notice, and we tried to make a kind of light, careless talk about the shawl, opening it out and admiring it. Then suddenly he got up and spoke. "She shall be buried in it," he said. "Peter shall have that comfort, and she would have liked it." Well, perhaps it was not reasonable, but what could we do or say? One gives people in grief their own way. He took it up and felt it. It is just such a shawl as she wished for when she was married, and her mother did not give it to her. I did not know of it till after, or she should have had it. She should. But she shall have it now. My mother looked so lovely in her death. She was always pretty, and now she looked fair and waxen and young, younger than Deborah, as she stood trembling and shivering by her. We decked her in the long soft folds. She lay smiling as if pleased, and people came, all Cranford came, to beg to see her, for they had loved her dearly, as well they might, and the country women brought posies. Old Clare's wife brought some white violets, and begged they might lie on her breast. Deborah said to me, the day of my mother's funeral, that if she had 100 offers, she would never marry and leave my father. It was not very likely she would have so many. I don't know that she had one, but it was not less to her credit to say so. She was such a daughter to my father, as I think there never was before or since. His eyes failed him, and she read book after book, and wrote and copied, and was always at his service in any parish business. She could do many more things than my poor mother could. She even once wrote a letter to the bishop for my father. But he missed my mother sorely. The whole parish noticed it. Not that he was less active, I think he was more so, and more patient in helping everyone. I did all I could to set Deborah at liberty to be with him, for I knew I was good for little, and that my best work in the world was to do odd jobs quietly and set others at liberty. But my father was a changed man. Did Mr. Peter ever come home? Yes, once. He came home a lieutenant. He did not get to be admiral, and he and my father were such friends. My father took him into every house in the parish. He was so proud of him. He never walked out without Peter's arm to lean upon. Deborah used to smile. I don't think we ever laughed again after my mother's death, and say she was quite put in a corner. Not but what my father always wanted her when there was letter-writing, or reading to be done, or anything to be settled. And then, said I, after a pause, then Peter went to sea again, and by my father died, blessing us both, and thanking Deborah for all she had been to him. And of course our circumstances were changed, and instead of living at the rectory and keeping 3 maids and a man, we had to come to this small house and be content with a servant of all work. But as Deborah used to say, we have always lived genteelly, even if circumstances have compelled us to simplicity. Poor Deborah. And Mr. Peter? Asked I. Oh, there was some great war in India. I forget what they call it, and we have never heard of Peter since then. I believe he is dead myself, and it sometimes fidgets me that we have never put on mourning for him. And then again, when I sit by myself, and all the house is still, I think I hear his step coming up the street, and my heart begins to flutter and beat. But the sound always goes past, and Peter never comes. That's Martha back? Oh, no, dear. No, I'll go, my dear. I can always find my way in the dark, you know. And a blow of fresh air at the door will do my head good, and it's rather got a trick of aching. So she pattered off. I had lighted the candle to give the room a cheerful appearance against her return. Was it Martha? Asked I. Yes, and I am rather uncomfortable, for I heard such a strange noise just as I was opening the door. Where? I asked, for her eyes were round with affright. In the street, just outside. It sounded like... Talking? I put in, as she hesitated a little. No. Kissing. Chapter 7. One morning, as Miss Matty and I sat at our work, it was before 12 o'clock, and Miss Matty had not yet changed the cap with yellow ribbons that had been Miss Jenkins's best, and which Miss Matty was now wearing out in private, putting on the one made in imitation of Mrs. Jameson's at all times when she expected to be seen. Martha came up and asked if Miss Betty Barker might speak to her mistress. Miss Matty assented and quickly disappeared to change the yellow ribbons, while Miss Barker came upstairs. But as she had forgotten her spectacles and was rather flurried by the unusual time of the visit, I was not surprised to see her return with one cap on the top of the other. She was quite unconscious of it herself, and looked at us with bland satisfaction. Nor do I think Miss Barker perceived it, for putting aside the little circumstance that she was not so young as she had been, she was very much absorbed in her errand, which she delivered herself of with the oppressive modesty that found vent in endless apologies. Miss Betty Barker was the daughter of the old clerk at Cranford, who had officiated in Miss Jenkins's time. She and her sister had had pretty good situations as ladies' maids, and had saved money enough to set up a milliner's shop, which had been patronized by the ladies in the neighborhood. Lady R.E.Langille, for instance, would occasionally give Miss Barkers the pattern of an old cap of hers, which they immediately copied and circulated among the elite of Cranford. I say the elite, for Miss Barkers had caught the trick of the place and piqued themselves upon their aristocratic connection. They would not sell their caps and ribbons to anyone without a pedigree. Many a farmer's wife or daughter turned away, huffed from Miss Barker's select millinery, and went rather to the universal shop, where the profits of Brown's soap and moist sugar enabled the proprietor to go straight to Paris, he said, until he found his customers too patriotic and John Bullish to wear what the Moonseers wore. London, where, as he often told his customers, Queen Adelaide had appeared only the very week before, in a cap exactly like the one he showed them, trimmed with yellow and blue ribbons, and had been complimented by King William on the becoming nature of her headdress. Miss Barkers, who confined themselves to the truth, and did not approve of miscellaneous customers, throve notwithstanding. They were self-denying good people. Many a time have I seen the eldest of them, she that had been maid to Mrs. Jameson, carrying out some delicate mess to a poor person. They only aped their betters in having nothing to do with the class immediately below theirs. And when Miss Barker died, their profits and income were found to be such that Miss Betty was justified in shutting up shop and retiring from business. She also, as I think I have before said, set up her cow, a mark of respectability in Cranford, almost as decided as setting up a gig in among some people. She dressed finer than any lady in Cranford, and we did not wonder at it, for it was understood that she was wearing out all the bonnets and caps and outrageous ribbons which had once formed her stock in trade. It was 5 or 6 years since she had given up shop, so in any other place than Cranford her dress might have been considered passé. And now Miss Betty Barker had called to invite Miss Matty to tea at her house on the following Tuesday. She gave me also an impromptu invitation, as I happened to be a visitor, though I could see she had a little fear lest, since my father had gone to live in Drumble, he might have engaged in that horrid cotton trade, and so dragged his family down out of aristocratic society. She prefaced this invitation with so many apologies that she quite excited my curiosity. Her presumption was to be excused. What had she been doing? She seemed so overpowered by it, I could only think that she had been writing to Queen Adelaide to ask for a receipt for washing lace. But the act which she so characterized was only an invitation she had carried to her sister's former mistress, Mrs. Jameson. Her former occupation considered, could Miss Matty excuse the liberty? Ah, thought I, she has found out that double cap, and is going to rectify Miss Matty's headdress. No, it was simply to extend her invitation to Miss Matty and to me. Miss Matty bowed acceptance, and I wondered that, in that graceful action, she did not feel the unusual weight and extraordinary height of her headdress. But I do not think she did, for she recovered her balance and went on talking to Miss Betty in a kind, condescending manner, very different from the fidgety way she would have had if she had suspected how singular her appearance was. "Mrs. Jameson is coming, I think you said?" asked Miss Matty. "Yes, Mrs. Jameson, most kindly and condescendingly, said she would be happy to come. One little stipulation she made, that she should bring Carlo. I told her that if I had a weakness, it was for dogs." "And Miss Pole?" questioned Miss Matty, who was thinking of her pool at Preference, in which Carlo would not be available as a partner. "I am going to ask Miss Pole, of course. I could not think of asking her until I had asked you, madam, the rector's daughter, madam. Believe me, I do not forget the situation my father held under yours." "And Mrs. Forrester, of course?" "And Mrs. Forrester. I thought, in fact, of going to her before I went to Miss Pole, although her circumstances are changed, madam. She was born at Tyrrell, and we can never forget her alliance to the Biggs of Bigelow Hall." Miss Matty cared much more for the little circumstance of her being a very good card player. "Mrs. Fitzadam, I suppose?" "No, madam. I must draw a line somewhere. Mrs. Jameson would not, I think, like to meet Mrs. Fitzadam. I have the greatest respect for Mrs. Fitzadam, but I cannot think her fit society for such ladies as Mrs. Jameson and Miss Matilda Jenkins." Miss Betty Barker bowed low to Miss Matty and pursed up her mouth. She looked at me with sidelong dignity, as much as to say, although a retired milliner, she was no democrat, and understood the difference of ranks. "May I beg you to come at near 6:30 to my little dwelling as possible, Miss Matilda?" Mrs. Jameson dines at 5, but has kindly promised not to delay her visit before that time. 6:30. And, with a swimming curtsy, Miss Betty Barker took her leave. My prophetic soul foretold a visit that afternoon from Miss Pole, who usually came to call on Miss Matilda after any event, or indeed in sight of any event, to talk it over with her. Miss Betty told me it was to be a choice and select few, said Miss Pole, as she and Miss Matty compared notes. Yes, so she said, not even Mrs. Fitzadam. Now, Mrs. Fitzadam was the widowed sister of the Cranford surgeon, whom I have named before. Their parents were respectable farmers, content with their station. The name of these good people was Hoggins. Mr. Hoggins was the Cranford doctor now. We disliked the name and considered it coarse, but as Miss Jenkins said, if he changed it to Piggins, it would not be much better. We had hoped to discover a relationship between him and that Marchioness of Exeter, whose name was Molly Hoggins. But the man, careless of his own interests, utterly ignored and denied any such relationship, although, as dear Mrs. Jenkins had said, he had a sister called Mary, and the same Christian names were very apt to run in families. Soon after Miss Mary Hoggins married Mr. Fitzadam, she disappeared from the neighbourhood for many years. She did not move in a sphere in Cranford society sufficiently high to make any of us care to know what Mr. Fitzadam was. He died and was gathered to his fathers without our ever having thought about him at all. And then Mrs. Fitzadam reappeared in Cranford, as bold as a lion, Miss Pole said, a well-to-do widow, dressed in rustling black silk, so soon after her husband's death that poor Miss Jenkins was justified in the remark she made that Bombazine would have shown a deeper sense of her loss. I remember the convocation of ladies who assembled to decide whether or not Mrs. Fitzadam should be called upon by the old blue-blooded inhabitants of Cranford. She had taken a large rambling house, which had been usually considered to confer a patent of gentility upon its tenant, because once upon a time, 70 or 80 years before, the spinster daughter of an earl had resided in it. I am not sure if the inhabiting of this house was not also believed to convey some unusual power of intellect, for the earl's daughter, Lady Jane, had a sister, Lady Anne, who had married a general officer in the time of the American War, and this general officer had written 1 or 2 comedies, which were still acted on the London boards, and which, when we saw them advertised, made us all draw up, and feel that Drury Lane was paying a very pretty compliment to Cranford. Still, it was not at all a settled thing that Mrs. Fitzadam was to be visited, when dear Miss Jenkins died, and with her something of the clear knowledge of the strict code of gentility went out too. As Miss Pole observed, as most of the ladies of good family in Cranford were elderly spinsters or widows without children, if we did not relax a little and become less exclusive by and by, we should have no society at all. Mrs. Forster continued on the same side. She had always understood that Fitz meant something aristocratic. There was Fitzroy. She thought that some of the king's children had been called Fitzroy, and there was Fitzclarence now. They were the children of dear good King William IV, Fitzadam. It was a pretty name, and she thought it very probably meant child of Adam. No one who had not some good blood in their veins would dare to be called Fitz. There was a deal in the name. She had had a cousin who had spelt his name with 2 little f's, Fawkes, and he always looked down upon capital letters, and said they belonged to lately invented families. She had been afraid he would die a bachelor, he was so very choice. When he met with a Mrs. Farrington at a watering place, he took to her immediately, and a very pretty genteel woman she was. A widow with very good fortune, and my cousin, Mr. Fawkes, married her, and it was all owing to her 2 little f's. Mrs. Fitzadam did not stand a chance of meeting with a Mr. Fitz anything in Cranford, so that could not have been her motive for settling there. Miss Matty thought it might have been the hope of being admitted into the society of the place, which would certainly be a very agreeable rise for ci devant Miss Hoggins, and if this had been her hope, it would be cruel to disappoint her. So everybody called upon Mrs. Fitzadam, everybody but Mrs. Jameson, who used to show how honourable she was by never seeing Mrs. Fitzadam when they met at the Cranford parties. There would be only 8 or 10 ladies in the room, and Mrs. Fitzadam was the largest of all, and she invariably used to stand up when Mrs. Jameson came in and curtsy very low to her whenever she turned in her direction. So low, in fact, that I think Mrs. Jameson must have looked at the wall above her, for she never moved a muscle of her face, no more than if she had not seen her. Still, Mrs. Fitzadam persevered. The spring evenings were getting bright and long when 3 or 4 ladies in calashes met at Miss Barker's door. Do you know what a calash is? It is a covering worn over caps, not unlike the heads fastened on old-fashioned gigs, but sometimes it is not quite so large. This kind of headgear always made an awful impression on the children in Cranford, and now 2 or 3 left off their play in the quiet, sunny little street, and gathered in wondering silence round Miss Pole, Miss Matty, and myself. We were silent, too, so that we could hear loud, suppressed whispers inside Miss Barker's house. "Wait, Peggy. Wait till I've run upstairs and washed my hands. When I cough, open the door. I'll not be a minute." And true enough, it was not a minute before we heard a noise between a sneeze and a crow, on which the door flew open. Behind it stood a round-eyed maiden, all aghast at the honourable company of calashes, who marched in without a word. She recovered presence of mind enough to usher us into a small room, which had been the shop, but was now converted into a temporary dressing-room. There we unpinned and shook ourselves, and arranged our features before the glass into a sweet and gracious company face, and then, bowing backwards with "After you, ma'am," we allowed Mrs. Forrester to take precedence up the narrow staircase that led to Miss Barker's drawing-room. There she sat, as stately and composed as though we had never heard that odd-sounding cough, from which her throat must have been, even then, sore and rough. Kind, gentle, shabbily dressed Mrs. Forrester was immediately conducted to the second place of honour, a seat arranged something like Prince Albert's near the Queen's. Good, but not so good. The place of pre-eminence was, of course, reserved for the Honourable Mrs. Jameson, who presently came panting up the stairs, Carlo rushing round her on her progress, as if he meant to trip her up. And now Miss Betty Barker was a proud and happy woman. She stirred the fire and shut the door, and sat as near to it as she could, quite on the edge of her chair. When Peggy came in, tottering under the weight of the tea-tray, I noticed that Miss Barker was sadly afraid lest Peggy should not keep her distance sufficiently. She and her mistress were on very familiar terms in their everyday intercourse, and Peggy wanted now to make several little confidences to her, which Miss Barker was on thorns to hear, but which she thought it was her duty as a lady to repress. So she turned away from all Peggy's asides and signs, but she made 1 or 2 very mal-apropos answers to what was said, and at last, seized with a bright idea, she exclaimed, "Poor sweet Carlo, I'm forgetting him. Come downstairs with me, poor little doggy, and it shall have its tea. Oh, yes, it shall." In a few minutes she returned bland and benign as before, but I thought she had forgotten to give the poor little doggy anything to eat, judging by the avidity to which he swallowed down chance pieces of cake. The tea-tray was abundantly loaded. I was pleased to see it. I was so hungry, but I was afraid the ladies present might think it vulgarly heaped up. I know they would have done at their own houses, but somehow the heaps disappeared here. I saw Mrs. Jameson eating seed cake, slowly and considerately, as she did everything, and I was rather surprised, for I knew she had told us on the occasion of her last party that she never had it in her house. It reminded her so much of scented soap. She always gave us Savoy biscuits. However, Mrs. Jameson was kindly indulgent to Miss Barker's want of knowledge of the customs of high life, and, to spare her feelings, ate 3 large pieces of seed cake with a placid, ruminating expression of countenance, not unlike a cow's. After tea, there was some little demur and difficulty. We were 6 in number. 4 could play at preference, and for the other 2 there was cribbage. but all except myself, I was rather afraid of the Cranford ladies at cards, for it was the most earnest and serious business they ever engaged in, were anxious to be of the pool. Even Miss Barker, while declaring she did not know Spadille from Manille, was evidently hankering to take a hand. The dilemma was soon put an end to by a singular kind of noise. If a baron's daughter-in-law could ever be supposed to snore, I should have said Mrs. Jameson did so then, for, overcome by the heat of the room and inclined to doze by nature, the temptation of that very comfortable armchair had been too much for her, and Mrs. Jameson was nodding. Once or twice she opened her eyes with an effort, and calmly but unconsciously smiled upon us. But by and by, even her benevolence could not equal to this exertion, and she was sound asleep. "It is very gratifying to me," whispered Miss Barker at the card-table to her 3 opponents, whom, notwithstanding her ignorance of the game, she was basting most unmercifully, "very gratifying indeed, to see how completely Mrs. Jameson feels at home in my poor little dwelling. She could not have paid me a greater compliment." Miss Barker provided me with some literature in the shape of 3 or 4 handsomely bound fashion books, 10 or 12 years old, observing, as she put a little table and a candle for my especial benefit, that she knew young people liked to look at pictures. Carlo lay and snored, and stared at his mistress's feet. He, too, was quite at home. The card-table was an animated scene to watch. 4 ladies' heads, with niddle-noddling caps, all nearly meeting over the middle of the table in their eagerness to whisper quick enough and loud enough, and every now and then came Miss Barker's, "Hush, ladies, if you please! Hush! Mrs. Jameson is asleep!" It was very difficult to steer clear between Mrs. Forrester's deafness and Mrs. Jameson's sleepiness, but Miss Barker managed her arduous task well. She repeated the whisper to Mrs. Forrester, distorting her face considerably in order to show, by the motion of her lips, what was said. And then she smiled kindly all round at us, and murmured to herself, "Very gratifying indeed. I wish my poor sister had been alive to see this day." Presently the door was thrown wide open. Carlo started to his feet with a loud snapping bark, and Mrs. Jameson awoke, or perhaps she had not been asleep, as she said almost directly the room had been so light she had been glad to keep her eyes shut, but had been listening with great interest to all our amusing and agreeable conversation. Peggy came in once more, red with importance. "Another tray." "Oh, gentility," thought I, "can you endure this last shock?" For Miss Barker had ordered, nay, I doubt not, prepared, although she did say, "Why, Peggy, what have you brought us?" and looked pleasantly surprised at the unexpected pleasure. All sorts of good things for supper, scalloped oysters, potted lobsters, jelly, a dish called Little Cupids, which was in great favour with the Cranford ladies, although too expensive to be given, except on solemn and state occasions, macarons sopped in brandy, I should have called it, if I had not known its more refined and classical name. In short, we were evidently to be feasted with all that was sweetest and best, and we thought it better to submit graciously, even at the cost of our gentility, which never ate suppers in general, but which, like most non-supper eaters, were particularly hungry on all special occasions. Miss Barker, in her former sphere, had, I dare say, been made acquainted with the beverage they call cherry brandy. We, none of us, had ever seen such a thing, and rather shrank back when she preferred it us. "Just a little glass, ladies, after the oysters and lobsters, you know. Shellfish are sometimes thought not very wholesome." We all shook our heads like female mandarins, but at last Mrs. Jameson suffered herself to be persuaded, and we followed her lead. It was not exactly unpalatable, though so hot and so strong that we thought ourselves bound to give evidence that we were not accustomed to such things by coughing terribly, almost as strangely as Miss Barker had done, before we were admitted by Peggy. "It's very strong," said Miss Pole, as she put down her empty glass. "I do believe there's spirit in it." "Only a little drop, just necessary to make it keep," said Miss Barker. "You know, we put brandy pepper over our preserves to make them keep. I often feel tipsy myself from eating damson tart." I question whether damson tart would have opened Mrs. Jameson's heart as the cherry brandy did, but she told us of a coming event respecting which she had been quite silent till that moment. My sister-in-law, Lady Glenmire, is coming to stay with me." There was a chorus of "Indeed," and then a pause. Each one rapidly reviewed her wardrobe as to its fitness to appear in the presence of a baron's widow, for of course a series of small festivals were always held in Cranford on the arrival of a visitor at any of our friends' houses. We felt very pleasantly excited on the present occasion. Not long after this, the maids and the lanterns were announced. Mrs. Jameson had the sedan chair, which had squeezed itself into Miss Barker's narrow lobby with some difficulty, and most literally stopped the way. It required some skilful manoeuvring on the part of the old chairman, shoemakers by day, but when summoned to carry the sedan dressed up in a strange old livery, long greatcoats with small capes, coeval with the sedan, and similar to the dress of the class in Hogarth's pictures, to edge and back and try at it again, and finally to succeed in carrying their burden out of Miss Barker's front door. Then we heard their quick pit-a-pat along the quiet little street as we put on our calashes and pinned up our gowns. Miss Barker hovering about us with offers of help, which, if she had not remembered her former occupation and wished us to forget it, would have been much more pressing. And that is where we are going to leave it for today. If you like what I'm doing here, please like, subscribe, get me out there, share me with all your friends. But otherwise, I'll be seeing you next time. Bye.